Hey everyone, so my name is Randy Kim with the Banh Mi Chronicles podcast. So I'm joined with a friend, Travis Chi Wing Lao, go by he, him, his pronouns. And Travis is an assistant professor of English at Kenyon College. His research and teaching focus on 18th and 19th century British literature and culture, health humanities, and disability studies. Alongside his scholarship, he has been published widely in a number of public scholarship and poetry publications, including three chapbooks, The Bone Setter, Pairing, Vagaries, and a full-length collection of poems, What Left is Tender. He is also the co-editor of Every Place on the Map is Disabled, an anthology of disability poetry and poetics, published with Northwestern University Press in for this year. And he was the winner of the Christopher Hewitt Award for Poetry, recipient of the Greater Columbus Arts Council Artist Elevated Award in Literature, and the Ohio Arts Council's Artists with Disabilities Access Program. So I am so glad we've known each other for a couple of years through social media. This is actually our first time having a real verbal conversation. So
That's so
welcome, welcome,
true.
welcome. Yeah, how are you doing, Travis? And how are you navigating 2026
Oh
so
my
far?
gosh. I can't complain. I feel like 2026 began a lot less turbulently than I'm used to. The past few years have always had a really rocky start to the year. I've been telling people this, but I think the end of last year I got this. I don't know, I've learned to start to trust my instincts on this, but I felt this weird sense that 2026 was going to be a maybe not transformative year, but a transitional year in some capacity. And I feel like I've been really committing myself to sort of seeing that process through. I'm rethinking a lot of the ways I do things. I'm slowing down a lot. And I'm trying to reconnect with facets of myself that I've kind of let go. So I feel
Mhm.
like I'm going about things differently, but thankfully things have been, knock on wood, fairly stable for me so far. That allows me to sort of do some of this personal work. But I'm up for tenure this year, so I feel like there's just been
Wow.
a lot of pressure to sort of meet the demands of my academic life, but for the most part, I can't complain. How about you?
Yeah, I think it's been a very interesting experience so far. I feel like I am weirdly in a mentally good place.
Mm,
Although I will say that yes, what you had just mentioned, I feel like there's been like recalibration. There's been practices that I don't align with anymore. And uh like I think about my people pleasing tendencies
same.
and actually I was just on my way to write a content about things that I've learned since turning 40, like the
Mm,
last 2+ years. And I think about how perfectionism is a tool of capitalism. And actually, I remembered a couple years ago when I was working for a foundation, one of our partners had said, perfection is the tool of white supremacy.
yes.
And I was like, wow. That was very profound. And I thought about it because we think about having to perform our labor and to get approval to get short-term rewards and how
Yep.
much it costs at our expenses. And that's something that I do relate to you because it's something that you have shared about academia, it's something that you shared in
Hmm.
your own work. And now that you're going into tenureship, how have you been able to navigate ways in which you try to lessen your people-pleasing perfectionist tendencies that we are unfortunately ingrained with?
Yeah. I mean, you've put it so perfectly. I think for the past 5 to 7 years, I've been working really in survival mode because academia is so broken right now that
Mhm.
I think a lot of us who graduated, I finished graduate school in 2018, and I graduated to an academic job market that is so sparse and collapsing that many of us are just grateful to have jobs. So a lot of us, we enter into our jobs and feel like, oh my gosh, it's a miracle we even have a tenure track job. So I guess we need to throw ourselves into it to make it feel like
Mhm.
it was worthwhile. And of course, we are extremely aware of all the people who don't get jobs, so we feel this kind of guilt, a survivor's guilt as well.
Mhm.
But I started realizing that that's not a sustainable way of working. If I'm going into my tenure year, working at a pace that's not sustainable, I will burn out before I even have a long-term career. And that sort of reality hit me in conjunction to being relatively recently diagnosed with ADHD, where I realized that I just the cycles and pace of academic life is so against people who work and think like myself.
Mhm.
So I think a lot of my changes lately have been being real about what I can actually do. And two, I think this is the work that maybe we both share, right? Is realizing how so much of our success and how so much of our way of surviving in the structures that we live in have involved us working against our own capacities. The model minority myth is a really, really mean drug, and we feel as as the children of immigrants, right, that we have obligation to succeed and to be ambitious and to use the word you used before to try to achieve as much perfection as possible, but it is actively killing us, right?
Yeah.
And I think enough is enough, and I think it really hit me within the past year or so that I can no longer do it this way.
Yeah. And how does it feel to make that shift? And what have you noticed in having um to take different
Mm,
shifts in the way you had practiced before? Because it is a
yeah.
lifelong of unlearning and unpacking
Yes.
like this
Yes.
whole what you mentioned, model minority myth, and also how we deal with intergenerational trauma and
Hmm.
then, dealing with the identities, with whether it's disability, neurodivergence,
Yeah.
um, and and a multitude of identities that end up forcing us to try to
Hmm.
outperform as some kind of way of belonging and feeling like you're worthy, that you have value in the society.
Yes.
How has that been to kind of like to start transforming? What have you noticed about some of the things that you've made for yourself?
Great question. So I think just for some context, I have been in versions of talk therapy and psychotherapy since 2013, in the sort of very early years of graduate school, when I realized, okay, I can't lie my way out of uh, not believing that I was dealing with anxiety and depression. But I think over these years, I realized that something was missing. I was still kind of struggling with my brain fog and cognition, and I, in general, just felt really dysregulated. Lately, I've been really immersing myself in, I guess, an area of therapy called somatic therapy
Mhm.
and nervous system regulation stuff, which has been and often is referred to as the missing piece for a lot of people. How do you sort of find safety and comfort in yourself in that is embodied in a real way rather than only thinking about it in a sort of heady way where you can have the right narratives for what's happening to
Mhm.
you. But what about your actual body? And I think that shift
Mhm.
to really thinking about the mind-body connection has been super important for me. But the first thing that I was thinking about when you asked that question was, it's amazing how much resistance we experience when we try to make shifts for ourselves this way. When we are used to people pleasing or
Mhm.
having no boundaries, right? People are used
Mhm.
to having these kinds of extractive relationships with us. And when we choose not to have it, people think that we've changed in negative ways or that we're not the same person anymore, or people are skeptical of these changes. And it's interesting to deal with not just the struggle of doing it yourself, but the resistance from people who we would expect to support us. And that resistance is something I never quite expected.
Yeah, and I think something that I've also like learned too, and there's a power of saying no to things, especially with setting boundaries.
Yeah.
Like, and that was something I was thinking about too, and what you were just saying, how saying no can be a very liberating experience. And I have learned how being able to not go to events, hangouts, have been actually good for my mental health. And
Yes.
also being able to say no to, okay, this is the work that I don't want to do, and
Right.
this is why. And if you don't like it, I'm sorry, but not really sorry, but like, do you find yourself saying no quite a bit now? And do you
Hmm.
find being able to scale back without that guilt festering in? Because that was something I used to do all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, that is totally it. I think when you're in the precarious position of being an early career academic where you don't know if you're going to have a job, the thought you always have is, I better say yes to everything because I may not be able to say yes later. But
Mm,
after a while, you realize that cannot keep going because eventually, I mean, as many people have been telling me over these years, when you say yes to one thing, you are really saying no to something else.
mhm,
I always understood that as a concept, but I didn't realize what that meant for me in a lived way when I started realizing I was actually saying no to my well-being in all sorts of other ways. So I've been very, very deliberate in saying no to things. Even things I sometimes want to do
Mhm.
with the belief, right, that I actually have more ambition than my limits actually are. So I've been trying to pare back, even doing less on purpose, right? To give myself more room for unexpected opportunities. Like, for instance, if I packed my week like I usually do, we wouldn't have been able to have this conversation. And this was
Mhm.
really important and meaningful to me, but I had no idea it was going to happen when I was planning other things. So leaving space, I think, has been really
Mhm.
important, even if that means inactivity. I think
Mhm.
boredom is really important. I remember
Mhm. Mhm.
being a kid, how important boredom was for creativity, and I'm in a
Mm.
weird way trying to bring that back into my daily life.
I think that's great too because yeah, I mean I have a lot of gaps in my schedule at times and I purposely do not fill them. And
Hmm.
when I'm on social media, like what I do is like I spend like a few hours touching grass even when it is cold because we live in the Midwest
Yes.
and and I and I feel like I need that space because the last thing I need to do, like I have, like when I had worked in nonprofit or when I was doing development work, and I would try to set up meetings with my executive directors, like what I would notice is that their calendar is like tight for like about a good 2 weeks before I can even get a 30-minute conversation about like strategies, and I'm like, yeah, like do you even eat? Do
Yeah.
you have time to go to the bathroom? I mean, do you have time to like have that? And I was like, yeah, this is not the life that I want to ever consume myself with because, I mean, my mom became a stroke survivor, when she had a stroke at work, like almost 15 years ago.
Oh,
And
wow.
luckily she survived that, but but her work life was she was so consumed with work, 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 work. And then my dad, had been working years as a metal welder. So I saw how that was detriment to their own mental and physical health. And then my late brother, I mean, he was obsessed with work. He kind of made it his own identity.
Yes.
And I would warn him about that. I was like, yeah, I don't think you should be traveling to another city every other couple days, which he was
Hmm.
doing. And I think that that was his way of trying to prove himself that he was worthy because, he wasn't academically successful, so he was always kind of like the black sheep. And so
Sure.
I think that in a way carried over and how this idea of like willing ourself is so not only detrimental to our own existence but like it doesn't serve anyone that we are working with, and it doesn't give us our ability to be creative, and it doesn't give us the ability to explore and to have time for self-reflection and to you know think of new ways of doing things or how we want to see the best value of our own journey along the
Yes.
way. So yeah, to kind of like start shifting, you live in Columbus, Ohio. You teach at Kenyon College. What can you
Hmm.
share about like your relationship to the city and campus so far?
Oh, yeah. So it's a really strange experience. Okay, context. I moved to Columbus in 2020 for this job, and I actually never once set foot on Kenyon's campus for that first year because the we were in the thick of the pandemic, and the college was essentially in this semi-virtual context. So I chose to teach all of my classes online, and it was so bizarre to start a job in which I had effectively never met my colleagues and would never meet the students I actually worked with. It was incredibly alienating. Now, of course, I commute to campus, and for those of you who are not familiar with the geography, in Central Ohio, Kenyon is about an hour and 10 minutes northeast of Columbus. So I drive an hour and 10 minutes, and I thought I would resent it, but actually, I really love the separation, especially as we're talking about boundaries. I love the separation between work and life. And now that I've been able to better immerse myself in Columbus, I'm so grateful to be here. Something my partner and I have been deeply afraid of was ending up in a city, sort of not by choice, but because of my job, where we wouldn't be able to be ourselves, we wouldn't feel safe. But Columbus is this. My partner and I often refer to it as this lovely open secret that we hope people don't end up discovering. traveling, that
Mhm.
Columbus is actually not only affordable, well, less so now, but just such a thriving queer art city in the middle of what people think of as a really red state.
Mhm.
And most people, when they think of Ohio, they think of Cleveland and Cincinnati. But I think Columbus kind of skirts under the radar, but it is just
Mhm.
it's a wonderful place that has really embraced me. I've felt so empowered here as a poet and an artist, and I that is the greatest wish I have for a place I'm going to be calling home now. Now that I
Mhm.
purchased my home here, it really does feel like I can actually lay down roots, which is something I really have never been able to do for
Mhm.
most of my early adulthood. So
Mhm.
I'm very fortunate in that respect.
Yeah, where were you living prior to Columbus?
Yeah. So I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 2018. So I was in Philly for 6 years. My first gig out of graduate school was a 2-year postdoc at the University of Texas at Austin. So I was in Austin, and that was such a shift from the Northeast. I grew up in the South. I really spent most of my childhood in Georgia. So the South felt familiar to me, but Austin. Now I think it's changed so much. Austin feels like a second California in the sense that so many California transplants move there. It's also incredibly
Mhm.
expensive and becoming
Mhm.
less and less diverse, unsurprisingly. But it was also a really alive art and music scene. So it was a really great place to spend 2 years. But then I got my job here and ended up moving to Columbus.
Mm. And what does it look like for you to be in academia when there's so
Hmm.
much uncertainty going on with the current administration? And how are you helping students to navigate this current reality? Because I can only imagine, like, especially when you are worried about what's
Hmm.
happening with your department and the university, where their focus is at, and also funding and how it affects you and your partner. But also, but how do you like try to find ways to navigate this with your students who are clearly feeling the threat and scared of, being adults in this unpredictable, chaotic world?
I mean, you've asked, I think, the hardest question over the past few years that I've been grappling with. So, a little bit about Kenyon. Kenyon is a predominantly white institution. It is a small liberal arts college that's private, so we tend to draw a fairly affluent, well-educated white demographic. But something that I've realized is that I fulfill a weird mentorship role as someone who is one of the few faculty members of color. Thankfully, in our department, we have quite a few Asian American scholars, so students feel in some ways that they can turn to us. But I have become, in a weird way, an informal mentor to so many students who feel displaced or unwelcome or undersupported. Unsurprisingly, I am a sort of shadow mentor to disabled, queer students of color. And to be honest, it's been incredibly hard to feel like I am in this position of having to be a sort of voice of reason, someone who can reassure them when I myself am deeply uncertain about the future, right? My mother, much to my mother's chagrin, I was joking with her that I said, wouldn't it be funny if I get tenure at the end of this academic year in May, and then tenure ceases to exist in the United States? My mother laughed for about 2 seconds and then asked me, "Are you serious?" And I said, "No, no, no. That I'm joking about this, but it's partially because I think it's a very possible reality." And I think learning to navigate my own deep sense of fear about what could happen in higher education. I mean, I think I've mentioned this to you before, but my work, especially in academia and my advocacy, has landed me on alt-right lists before. I've, been the target of hate mail, and I'm that is not foreign to me, but the fact that we now live in a culture in which that is much more intensified and my students feel deeply unsafe, it's been incredibly hard to sort of find safety in myself to then be able to impart safety to them. But it is, the more and more I think about it, it is perhaps the most important work that I can do in this moment because I feel like, my research is one thing, but that feels like it has such a small audience when I'm in the classroom working with students where I have real relationships with them, that feels important, like the most important work we can do at a moment where there are so few spaces for students to sit together across different experiences and backgrounds to really think about difficult concepts and to develop real relationships. So I feel like I've been putting my heart and energy into this kind of work because it feels transformative for whatever future we hope to
Mhm.
have.
And what have you seen in terms of hopes and promises with the students that you're connecting with, but also
Mm,
with the university, the campus, especially in response to a lot of the visceral things that are happening. And like,
hmm.
because I know that when you look at movement work in the past, like it's always the young folks that have
Yes.
really stepped up and used their energy to fight for their futures. What have you
Hmm.
seen and what have you observed so far?
Yeah. I think this has always been true, but getting direct evidence of it in my classrooms and in my office during office hours with mentorship, I've really seen it happen. I think there's the truism that the kids are just so much further ahead than we were. I think about my queer and trans students who have such a sense of who they are,
Mhm.
such a sense of why things matter, and a fluency in the kinds of discourse that we have in a way that my 18-year-old self, I came out at 18 and had no idea what the hell it meant to identify as gay. I had no idea of queer history. I just feel like the students care in a way that I have such respect for. And I think because they, like our generation, have experienced the sense of disillusionment that their futures have been kind of taken from them and have been sort of falsely promised as a kind of meritocracy, I think a lot of them are coming into education and the work that we do with very clear and sober eyes in the sense that they are not deceived into thinking that this is just going to come about by itself, that change is going to come about by itself, that it has to be actively made in the world. And they're just so ambitious and active in their communities in a way that like I have just I don't think I had enough of a sense of who I was in order to be doing that work so early.
Mhm. And I know that you had mentioned, or when I was reading your bio, you teach 18th and 19th century uh, British literature. It's
Hmm.
interesting because I was an English major as an
Mm,
undergrad, and I was never like, I did take a lot of classes in British literature, and it never connected with me. And
hmm.
I used to blame my neurodivergence on that because I'm like, okay, if it's not getting to me, it's I'm looking at a bunch of foreign words that are
Hmm.
like irrelevant. So. I'm curious to know what like gravitated you to that work and then also with poetry.
Yeah, I mean, such a great question. So a kind of running joke in my career has been people have. I wrote about this in an essay called Me Search, and there is a kind of joke in the academy about, people who tend to work on precisely what their identity experiences are. And I feel like it cuts both ways. People look at me and they meet me for the first time, and then they assume that I must do Asian American studies or queer
Mhm,
studies.
mhm,
Or the opposite, which is that, oh, interesting, you work on Britain. Like, why do you work on the work of your oppressor, essentially?
mhm,
And I've been sort of navigating this split my entire career.
mhm,
And the answer really give is that for me, I I feel like something I've really been struggling with, but also have been trying to do more thought about, and maybe this is a way of getting at the answer regarding poetry, is I've been trying to reconcile the fact that so much of my success in academia has been predicated on my proximity to whiteness. I study the white canon. I write, speak, and express myself in legibly white professional ways. And my parents, right, when I was growing up, insisted that English be my first language because they knew that was the gateway to opportunity. So a lot of my work recently has been asking myself this very question.
mhm,
Why have I aligned myself with whiteness? How has my success been predicated on my capacity to assimilate? And really ask the question, why is it that I'm drawn to this work? And I think
mhm,
I have two answers for this. One is the period that I work in, the 18th and 19th centuries. This was the period of much of the colonial project in Britain.
mhm,
Hong Kong, where I was born and raised, is was colonized in this time. So seeing the histories of how we arrived at this moment of colonization, but also seeing in this period how so much of our conceptions of race, gender, and class kind of came into being. I felt like I was getting a history, a genealogy of how we arrived at our current moment. And I think, you know, facing the reality that I am studying the literature of the very people that colonized my people, I feel like I'm better able to understand my relationship to whiteness and how historically, right, this is a relationship that's been mediated through centuries
Mhm.
of oppression, cruel education, violence, enslavement, all sorts of things. I needed to see those things for what they were. And for me, I had to look at the literature of my oppressor really to better understand that rather than, explore that through the cultural production of people who look like me. And it's been painful work, but I feel like it's also been important work for me. And I'm glad that
Mhm.
um, my studies have brought me closer to the histories of my people that I feel like I didn't really do justice to growing up because my
Mhm.
parents wanted me to assimilate so quickly.
Mhm. It feels very relatable in that sense too, because um, I saw, well, my parents saw English as a gateway, and it came at a cost. I mean, I wasn't able to speak Vietnamese or Khmer to my relatives and
Hmm.
Vietnamese to my grandma, and that was something that had always been a source of my own tension. I also, thought about I don't know if you ever read the book Babel by R.F. Kuang.
So good.
It is, and I felt like hearing what you had just shared about, British colonialism and, seeing how academia is also part of the colonial system. It really brings it to light. Like, also, what's also important, like, my dad never liked me, going into journalism and being an English major,
Mm,
and and I understood why, because it's like I'm assimilating myself like completely. And I think that even though my dad knew that that was the gateway to my success, it was also like at a cost. Like
yes.
I was starting to be a very different person versus what he would have wanted. And I always I always like wondered about um like like when we think of like Asians teaching English,
Hmm.
whether it's like abroad or at a university setting, um, what's very interesting is that when I think of the Vietnam War, when I think of the Cambodian genocide and all of, and also like the Asia Pacific wars in World War II, a lot of it has been written by white men. The history's been
Yes,
recorded by white men, researched by white men.
that's
And I
right.
think it's very ironic, but it's also like it tells you that, okay, well, they're doing it from their lens. Like the Ken Burns of the world, which, I had a conversation yesterday um with a director of a historical museum, and we both criticized, like, Ken Burns was like having this obsession where, well, if the United States did this or that, they could have won the war.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, but like, while conveniently leaving behind the people who were deeply, deeply affected by it. So I
that's
think
right.
it's also kind of our way of like saying that, okay, if we're gonna learn British literature, why do we, why can't we do it in a way that also goes beyond the glorification of it? Let's also talk about the impact. Let's talk about the people that um that inspired, these writings, and why are they celebrated? So I think that we
Hmm.
also have to take a closer examination from a non-white lens too, because we're used to our history being written and told and in ways that are very consequential. So that's
Hmm.
something that I thought about too. And
You're right.
um yeah. And so how do you think poetry can be used as
Mm.
a way to document history and in elevating a lot of the marginalized voices and the intersecting identities that you or folks that carry?
Yeah. First of all, I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the things I've realized that is my ethical responsibility now as a scholar of color in the academy has been to do that work of recovering the voices of the most marginalized. So when I teach British literature, people assume that the syllabus is almost entirely white. Yes, it's going to be quite white dominated in terms of what's been recovered from the archive, but I spend a lot of time telling my students that there isn't just one 18th century or one 19th century, but a series of multiple ones depending on which subjects you're focusing on. And it's been a gift to be able to challenge my own education, which was very canonical, to realize that I have gaps in my own education that I need to, through my teaching, begin to mend. And I think that that actually leads me to addressing your question about why poetry. I think academia was incredibly stifling to me. I started really writing and publishing as a poet in 2016. This is coincidentally my later years of graduate school when I was just so exhausted and I guess I can say it now. I haven't really ever said it this way, but maybe this is the truth. I was kind of tired of assimilating on the level of thought and writing.
Mhm,
My dissertation made me write in ways that I found restrictive. It felt I had so much imposter syndrome in graduate school
mhm,
for obvious reasons. And I think poetry for me opened up this avenue for asking really different kinds of questions, being more uncertain, speculative, without feeling like I had to do the kinds of writing that I do in academic writing, which is very argument focused. It's very combative. It's very much about undermining other people. I wanted poetry was for me being able to have conversations with other people and with my history. So I think poetry, as I've understood it, right, has been an opportunity for me to reconnect with history, but also to I say this a lot with young queer people that I think the one thing that comes with identification. So when we say I identify as, and in this case, I'd say queer, disabled, or Chinese American, we have an ethical responsibility to know the histories of those identifications. And for me, poetry has been the place where I have, put my money where my mouth is to actually do that connective work with history while also thinking through the really strange interconnected experiences and oppressions of my multiple marginalized experiences. How does my Chinese Americanness, my queerness, my disability intersect in real ways that aren't clean, right? We are not these we often refer to intersectionality as this kind of term that implies that we're all just like a series of cross sections of different identities, but there's tension there. There's some beautiful moments of overlap, but there's tension there. And I feel like poetry is the place where that there's space for me to explore those things, if that makes sense.
yeah, yeah. And I'm also like very curious because you have different intersecting identities being neurodivergent,
Hmm.
disabled, queer, and Chinese American. And so when you when you study like the poets and other writings and authors, how has it in a way helped you to understand, accept, and
Mm,
embrace like all the identities that you carry? Like what have you learned about these writings and being in this work?
mm. So the book I just published, What's Left is Tender, was in some ways a challenge for me to break out of a mold that I have really kind of put myself in. So when I started writing and publishing in 2016 as a poet, uh, I was very much an out queer and disabled poet, but I, for many reasons, avoided writing about my Chinese American experience. And I think it's because, and I'd be very curious what you think of this. But I felt like my Chineseness was the most legible thing on my body, so that I resented the idea that people assumed that when they saw me, they would assume that I would be either a writer who writes in Chinese or writes about Chineseness in general. I got very tired of a very particular kind of um, Chinese immigrant narrative that we saw so much at the time when I started writing. It's usually about trauma, about the Cultural Revolution, or about sort of immigrant oppression. And to be very clear, those things are important stories, but I wanted to tell a different one. So I, for the most part, avoided writing about my Chineseness and turned to queerness and disability as a place for me to explore other facets of myself. But in What's Left is Tender, I I promised myself that I would confront some of my own anxieties about why I didn't want to write about my Chineseness. And I think the reason for that was twofold. One was what I mentioned before, which is admitting to myself that I I was successful as an academic and as a writer because of my assimilation and my disavowal of my Chineseness. But then secondly, I think there was a part of me that was afraid of getting it wrong, that I would be betraying or in some ways misrepresenting my heritage. I was afraid to tell their stories because I felt like I didn't have the right to, especially as someone who has a very mixed relationship with many members of my family as a queer person. So I avoided it for a long time. But in this collection, I finally wrote about some very difficult things related to my family, and it felt liberating.
Mm.
It felt like a reconnection with a part of me that, for many reasons, both positive and negative, I've had to keep at bay. But I feel more in touch with who I am now because I confronted some of those demons, I suppose, that have followed me for many years in terms of being afraid to fully embrace my Chineseness or feeling excluded by my Chinese family, that made me resent my affiliation with them.
It is something that I resonate with to different layers because, like, for a long time, I mean, people would kind of assume, like, well, what are you?
Mm.
And I have to say Vietnamese and then Cambodian. And And if they do know those two places, it's also because it's a source of trauma that they are
Sure.
mostly aware of. That's the first thing they think about. No one's thinking about pho back then. They're thinking about, or banh mi. They're thinking about like the Vietnam War. They're thinking
Yes.
about, the gooks and the
Hmm.
Charlies. And then for Cambodia, they think of like, Angelina Jolie and the Cambodian genocide, the skulls like on display. And
Yep.
so it's very macabre. And I always felt like it was a very dark history that I have to contend with. And I think part of what you were mentioning of like disavowing, there was a period of time where I was disavowing a lot of it in my 20s. Um, like unintentionally in some ways, like very passive aggressively because I really couldn't speak the language very well. I was already shamed from community members and people I came across with for not doing it. And so that I knew that I was not a part of them. And that
Yeah.
was the language that I was given. Um, I had, I think I went to Vietnam one time. The first time I went was in 2009 to visit family members, and it was a visceral experience. Like I felt like I had to rely on my uncle to do things to kind of help me around, and I was fairly new to traveling,
Hmm.
and I was like a deer in headlights. I really felt very restrained. I couldn't, you know, be. I couldn't feel free to explore and ask the questions that have been like burning inside of me, and then when you think about like the tragedies of our own um what's associated with our identities, it feels like this emotional burden. And I
Yes.
saw that when I was doing storytelling performances where I tend to be one of the only Asian or maybe sometimes even the only person of color um, performing while other white people from that are transplants, Chicago transplants from the suburbs, are just talking about like fun, trying to be wannabe comedians because Chicago's
Yeah.
a hub for comedians, and they try to be funny and talk about bad relationship dating. And I'm here talking about, you know, reconciliation with my father
Mm.
and talking about his genocide survival experience. So it's layers different than other people who were telling it. I felt like, okay, well, you know, and I became very embittered by
Sure.
that for a number of years, and I think that's kind of what made me like shift completely from that world to find spaces of folks that um, are understanding and more empathetic of the identities that I carry as also as a queer person. So yeah, I also felt like I was in conflict with my community for a number of years because of the language loss, because of the queer identity, and because of the tragedies that have happened. And that's a lot to take on. But I think when I try to do my work, or when I think about what being a queer Vietnamese Cambodian American means, I like to do it from a place of abundance rather than from a deficit
Yes.
based level. And that is something I try to think about. I mean, I went back to the homeland, both homelands, like a year ago, and it profoundly changed me. I was able to do it on my own and discover people on my own and be able to understand certain things that I have been wanting to ask and
Yes.
experience all along. So I think that, yeah, for a lot of us, it is again like the unpacking and the unlearning of things that we used to tell ourselves, and how disavowing has been in a way at the cost of trying to be accepted and to be successful, like for you in academia, for me, like whether it's in the field that I'm in, whether it's a nonprofit, um, that 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 we have to sometimes be okay with irritating our irritating the people, that the powers that be that hold these spaces. And
Mhm.
I think that is a very risky thing to do, but I think it feels very necessary. And yeah, I'm really glad that you got to a good place with trying to make peace or reconciling with a lifelong challenge of understanding your own identities and how to work through, the flaws and the trauma that you experience, being in these communities.
Yeah. I mean, I'm grateful that I've been given the space and really the privilege to be able to do it in the ways that I have. And I mean, I think something that we share in common is this struggle of feeling like either or and sometimes neither nor, where one of my favorite games that I play, and it's a rather unfair game, I realize. I often ask my students, as a way of sort of having them think a little bit about how academia works, I often ask them, for a second, draw what you think a professor looks like, and I'm going to guarantee you that they do not look like me. So there's so many times where I felt like no matter how much I assimilate, I will never be the image of the authoritative professor that people imagine. I've had students literally see me on the first day of class and then doubt my capacity to do this work because they're used to a bearded man in elbow patches and a tweed blazer who's going to be telling them about the history of British literature. And there are days where I'm like, wow, no matter what I do, I will always in some ways be an imposter. So I think on the one hand, right, this can feel really disheartening, like, well, no, I mean, I guess I'll never assimilate. But on the other hand, I think it makes me really remember that being an outsider also means that you have the opportunity to change things from within. So a lot of my work has been being this squeaky wheel or sometimes an agitator in academic spaces because I already stand out for different reasons. But at the same time, right, on the other hand, I feel like I have not always. I've not always felt truly Chinese or Chinese American because I have not always been embraced by my own community for any number of reasons. And that internalized racism, what stuff that I've absorbed from not just the white American facets of my life, but also from my shunning and feeling outcast from my Chinese side, right? It's on me to work through that rather than to continue that cycle where I use essentially one facet of my identity to reoppress the other. And like that for me has been the real shift rather than just letting it continue and perpetuate because I'm fully aware that I have reproduced some of that cruelty against
Mhm.
members of my community and my family because I resented not being included in those ways. But that's
Mm.
not a good way forward. It's not a life I want to live.
Boy, that is incredibly relatable because yeah, because a lot of the buildup of the resentment and the disavowal, it becomes a weapon to the
Yes.
people that you were very upset at. I certainly did that with my family, my parents specifically. I had lashed out. Like sometimes there's like when I've been on the board, for the Cambodian Museum, for example, there were times when I would just lash out and have like very heated arguments, but also because I think it's also years and years of like not feeling less than, and it becomes like a
Yes.
weapon, and I can be pretty cruel, as I've learned over the years, because it comes from a place of unhealed trauma, and I have had to, like, think about the harm and the impact that it has on other folks who are bystanders to
Mhm.
this. And so that's something I think about a lot, and even with my the relationship I have with my brothers, and how we had a very adversarial relationship at times, and it was hard for us to be emotionally vulnerable because we were always, trying to separate ourselves away from our family identity. And I think that kind of like also um came into our relationship. I also think of Bowen Yang too, because I had this bitch fest about him the other day, about assimilation and and
Mm.
but I also think about like what it means to um the cost of assimilating and knowing that no matter how much you assimilate, you will be at the short end of the stick when you try to be, you know, when you try to go in places um that white people have, in terms of being provocative, and you're not
Hmm.
afforded the ability to have mistakes,
Yes,
and you
that's
get
right.
dropped like a fly. And I think, Matt Rogers, who is his like mostly white counterpart on his podcast, basically, took a lot of heat, but then, you know, Bowen, agreed to what he was saying and didn't fight back on it or didn't challenge him. And Bowen's taking a lot of the heat for it, and it's like,
Hmm.
yeah, this is what happens. Like, no one knows who Matt Rogers is, but everyone knows who Bowen Yang is. I mean, so I think that there's a dynamic in play too that, yeah, he could be like Matt Rogers is like the Justin Timberlake, to Bowen's Janet. It's like you see what happens and how that really, like no matter how famous, no matter how much access you have, you're always going to be reminded at the end of the day that you're not one of them.
Hmm.
And that boot doesn't taste very good when kiss it hard enough, I guess. But
That's a good
yeah,
way to put it.
yeah. I'm also very curious about like how does that transform into like your into your relationships with
Mm.
with queer folks, or in your dating relationship,
Mm.
because I think that that's something that I've also had to um really think about a lot over the years,
Mm.
and thinking about why these days white gay men are very intimidated by me, and I think part of it's because I do put up I don't want to say a facade, but I also feel like I put up a very militant way of doing things. Sometimes I'll say things to be very provocative and see how you can handle my viewpoints. Like first and foremost, I'll give you
Mm.
like this dead eye contact and be like, yeah, well, this is how I feel, and um and if you really want to go along with it, then okay, well, I'll give you a test on it. But other than that, like I feel like I
Mm.
do a lot of like interrogating, and I think it scares people for a good reason, but it keeps people on their guard. But I'm curious about your
Mm.
own experiences of how that informs your dating relationships.
Sure. Yeah. So a little bit of context for me. A lot of my queer identity formation was in the Los Angeles area. So I went to UCLA for undergrad, came out at 18, fresh out of the South, had no idea what I was doing, ended up in a gay mecca that was, for me, just wildly out of my comfort zone. I had no idea that I could ever be around that many Asian people before, let alone queer Asian people who seemed way more sure of who they were than I was. But I think two things happened when I was in LA. Number one was I realized very quickly the community sentiment of inclusion, of love is love, everyone's welcome, was in fact more of a political slogan than actual practice. I was very indebted to a particular space in Los Angeles called Rage Nightclub. On Fridays, there was a particularly Asian night called Game Boy. And it was such a haven for me for those really formative years where I felt like I saw myself in the people who attended. But I think always in the shadows of that was the ever-present reality that nights like that also drew fetishists, it drew voyeurs, it drew people who very much their entire purpose of engaging with me was to objectify.
Mhm.
And being objectified in the worst forms, in dehumanizing ways, really taught me that just because I was becoming intimate with someone did not mean that they saw me as a full person. In fact, I could be satisfying any number of fantasies for them, but I ultimately would never be truly a full human to them.
Mm,
And that haunted me for many years. As someone who has dated primarily white men, I have to be very, very vigilant about this. I've been in a now just over a decade-long relationship with my partner who is white, grew up in the Midwest, sort of, a farm boy. It was just such a different set of upbringings, and I think so much of our relationship over the past decade has been working through these fundamental differences, and calling him sometimes on moments where racism creeps in the most sort of unexpected and microaggressive kind of ways. But I think the hardest part for me learning to date has been figuring out what are the moments where a fight is worth having, and when should I just simply part ways or actually see it as an opportunity where I could invest in someone. I think for a long
mm,
time, I too had this approach of just being, somewhat standoffish, judgmental in advance because it was like a filter for whether or not someone could really handle it. But I also realized that it was making me, I guess, more hardened as a person. I
mm,
wasn't as compassionate and receptive to people. I was prejudging them very quickly.
mm,
And I started to develop a bit of a reputation for, when people would meet me for the first time, they would say, "Oh my gosh, I was so scared to meet you because I feel like you were just going to tear me apart the first time we'd meet." And I was surprised by that because I don't think about myself as that kind of person, but maybe for many defensive reasons, I was doing that. I was sort of projecting that.
mm,
So I think as I've created intimacies with different people over these years, I've realized how important it is to sort of meet vulnerability where it is, but then also not be the kind of person that I'm more naturally inclined to be, which is completely vulnerable at all times to people
mm,
who don't deserve it, right? I need to be more selective and more thoughtful about who I share that vulnerability with, while at the same time being more receptive and open to their vulnerability when they share it, rather than assume the worst of intentions. So it's
mm,
about navigating trust, risk, and vulnerability, and being judicious about when
mm.
those kinds of experiences ought to happen. And then also accepting that not everyone has your best interest in mind, even if they might be sexually or emotionally intimate with me in some capacity.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really helpful this is a helpful observation and experience that you've been sharing here because yeah, it's like sometimes I always don't want to be seen as a feisty, as a
Yep.
chaotic demon as I can be, which I don't have shame on that part, but I also want to be seen as being tender, as being compassionate. And I mean, these are things that I still continue to work on, but I also think like there is always a battle between like, okay, with this when is this person capable of hearing me out? Because I
Yes.
know that I do get quick to judge and I do get quick to react, especially with things that do trigger me. And I've done this, but people that I've been friends with that I've had to block on Facebook or social media,
Hmm.
and I've had plenty of those moments. And but I think about, okay, um, what is my non-negotiable? What do I value most?
That's right.
What alignments and what does reciprocity mean in my
There we go.
friendships and in my relationships? So I
Yeah.
like to, like, if a person's sharing their vulnerability, I feel like, okay, now I'm starting to feel like I could be safe with you. Like I feel like I feel like there is a meaningful exchange, and I think that's something that I'm still learning through.
Yes.
I feel like I don't know if I could be dating full time. I'm more like I'm just kind of, I feel like, I think I was talking with a friend. I said, I'm happy with platonic love, to be honest with you,
Sure.
because I just don't have the time to mentally, handle being in a full-time relationship, I guess. So
It's work. It's
yeah,
work.
it is a lot of work, and I think that it's not by traditional hetero, um, practices that we were taught to value. Now it's like, okay, well, there's different ways of how we handle our partnerships, and what it can look like and what the negotiables are between each other on a consenting way, in a very consenting way.
Great.
Um, I'm curious about um, your work through disability justice
Hmm.
and for yourself, like what does access look like to you
Mm.
in this world? Because I know that disability can mean a multitude of things. Um, it's also visible and invisible, and
Yes.
I think that there's a lot to think about what does disability look like, but also what does access in the end look like?
Hmm. Yeah. So I will preface this by saying that I can only speak to a very specific snapshot of what disability looks like for me. I often, when I tell people in terms of how I identify as a disabled person, I often refer to myself as having scoliosis-related disabilities. And you might be saying, well, what does that actually mean? So my spine has two curves in it. So if you looked at it directly, I would have a reverse S shape in my spine. And the reason I use scoliosis related disabilities is actually I'm indebted to a colleague of mine, Mary Lisa Johnson, who started using this term to refer to the number of different conditions that are attached to scoliosis. So for me, it's not just chronic pain. For me, it's brain fog. It's also my incapacities of breathing, my mobility issues, right? Disability for me is very embodied. And I think for me, I've been thinking a lot about what the disability activist Mia Mingus has described as access intimacy. And access intimacy, in a nutshell, right, is the idea of entering into a space, being seen by other bodies and minds in the room, and feeling like your needs are being anticipated and met with genuine desire to help make you feel more at home. And we're really investing in relationships. That the word you used earlier, I really want to emphasize, and I feel like this is something that we're sort of both thinking about in really real ways in our lives, which is reciprocity. I really think that's where access starts, and I think whenever I've been asked to describe access, I think the broadest definition, right, is a sense of invitation and welcome for the broad sense of bodies, broad range of bodily and mental, spiritual, and emotional experiences that share a space. And I think for me, the most important thing I try to emphasize in all of my work, in my mentorship, in my poetry, and my teaching, is that access is not a single thing. Unfortunately, because we work in, structures like academia, for instance, that want to see things like accessibility or diversity as boxes they can check off. There's this implication that like if you just do the following things, everything is going to be accessible, but it is never no place is ever fully accessible, and ultimately accessibility is a contingent thing based on the bodies and minds that are in that room. So what may be accessible in this moment for this group of people may not be accessible at all for other people. Another useful term that I like to think about is if access intimacy is people's reciprocal relationship and support of one another for a more accessible space, access friction is also something that happens where sometimes an accessibility measure for one person may actively disable someone else. So I can imagine, for example,
Mhm.
someone who's a wheelchair user, they may need extra space to navigate a particular room or even a ramp, for instance. But someone without a mobility issue that is maybe sensitive to sensation or touch may find that room deeply inaccessible to them. So having space also for access friction alongside access intimacy, I think is really important. And like that's where the work is moving
Mhm.
forward, rather than seeing this like check. Everyone wants checklists, right? Oh, I want to make sure I cover my bases so I can say that my event is fully accessible. But are we
Mhm.
actually addressing the real access needs of the people in the room, or trying to do a kind of blanket one size fit all model when really we fundamentally know that everyone's bodies and minds are different. So I think that's
Mhm.
how I would respond to that question, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. It does because like it helps to kind of think about like access intimacy is something that I didn't think about in that terminology, but I also think when when you are in creating a space, you know. I mean, this is something that I think about when I've had to do events or create events. It's like, okay, like how do we shift from like, okay, is this accessible, but like, but talking to the people that you want to bring, that what are their needs? How can we best emotionally support them as along with that? How do we make sure that that there's priority, that there's attention to what they're looking for and not making the assumption of what they need or don't need? Um, I think about that too because um you know, as a person who watches and takes care of my mom, you know, like I go to the grocery store and there are times when I will see the electric wheelchairs not working or
Hmm.
At an H Mart or go to Seafood City. Hate to call them up. Well, actually, no, I don't care. But like when I would go to a Seafood City like in Chicago, I remembered there was no wheelchair at all, and
Yep.
I was extremely livid. You know, there were times when I would go to certain places and I'm like, wow, you know, and actually, even my cousin's wedding, knowing knowing my mom, it's like they had stairs to their church. There was no elevator, and I was really trying so hard to
Yeah.
like to keep my cool, and because you know. I'm in a church, you know, and of course the amount of expletives were about to explode, and you know,
Sure.
and I'm I'm just like I'm angry for my mom. I'm angry for the lack of consideration that was given. It's like you do know my mom's disabled, and I have been making it very clear, like she can't go to this church. I mean, I had to like help lift her up or you know to get there, but yeah, was I very bitter the entire day? Absolutely, you bet I was. Um, and I think about that too in places them where like the labor, the intensive labor that folks who have disabilities that have to like do their research to try to figure out, okay, you know, the parking space, the is there an elevator? How big is the elevator? The width. Um, there's a lot of work that goes into it, and it's usually disabled folks that do the legwork on this, and not the people that provide the spaces for it. So,
That's right.
I think it's an important call out, and it's also an important conversation that we still need to have because, you know, access is everything, and it's also something that I'm learning because I'm mostly able-bodied, you know, but I also recognize that my body is very conditional.
Hmm.
My ableness is very conditional. Like I could have, God forbid, a stroke like in a year and I may not be able to walk.
That's right.
I mean, though there are times when your body will just not be there for you in that full capacity as it used to be, and and it forces you to make changes in your life. But unfortunately, our society hasn't been able to build a a system and um, a place where it can feel more accessible and inclusive and and intimate. So yeah, um, with that said, I know Alice Wong, a
Yeah.
longtime Asian American disability advocate, had passed away, and I mean this is a profound loss for the community, for all of our communities that really learned about her work. And, you know, Alice has been a pioneer and has been able to frame ways of how we view disability and how we view people with disabilities. And you've struck a friendship with her over the years, and I know her loss was very profound on you. And I was wondering if you could share your own thoughts about your memories of Alice, but also what you feel her legacy has been, or what should be her legacy overall
Mm.
after it's all said and done.
Yeah. So I it's hard to even begin to define Alice's impact on me as a disabled person, as a writer, as a member of this community. I owe Alice such a profound amount of gratitude for the opportunities she's made possible. She's published my work as part of her anthologies. She has referred me in so many different capacities as someone that people can consult and trust. Most recently, it was just before she passed away in October. Alice had won the MacArthur Genius Grant, and through her endless generosity, brought a series of disabled scholars of color to meet in San Francisco, to have a real conversation about the state of the field and about, what does it mean to be disabled and a person of color doing this work. And Alice did this all of her own accord, and it was actually the first time I actually got to meet Alice in person. I got to go to her apartment, meet her for the first time, despite having, connected with her for years. It was a powerful experience for me, not just because, and I feel like this is something that is such a reflection of who Alice is. Alice, because of the apparatus of her breathing, and her what's actually accessible for her, and for the risk given her compromised state. We were all masked, but she set up this really, really beautiful spread of sweets, desserts, and drinks for
Mm,
us to gather together. But I think the thing that really touched me was the fact that we all knew, and Alice knew herself, that she wouldn't be able to partake in any of it, but she
mm,
wanted us to have that experience of being together. And she invited me to stay a little bit longer to just chat, and we really connected with our sort of shared Cantonese heritage. But I think to answer your question about what her legacy is, I think I will never presume to define someone else's legacy for them, but in terms of the legacy that she leaves behind that resonates most with me is I think disability justice remains a very white enterprise. And I think the sort of elite capture of disability justice terminology and accessibility as something that's marketable has been really it's become very white. And I think Alice is a very powerful reminder of the fact that this work cannot be and will not be an entirely white project. But I think this is one thing that many people forget about Alice's work, that Alice was a very strong advocate for not just the autonomy of disabled people, but also the right for disabled people to experience pleasure. I believe very strongly in Alice's vision of a world where disabled people are not imagined to be without sex or sexless, but
mm,
actually empowered and should be empowered to have vibrant sexual lives. And Alice is the one who would write an essay about the sort of fraught experience of self-pleasure or being pleasured by someone else when you are sort of in the need
mm,
of accessibility and accommodation, right? You are vulnerable in ways that are so different than for many able-bodied people. And I want that element of Alice's work to be alive and well. I can see more sanitized versions of Alice's of legacy as omitting this fact. But I think of her advocacy for disabled sex and sexuality to be one of the most
mm.
important legacies she leaves behind.
Thank you for naming that, and thank you for sharing your own memories of Alice Wong. And Alice, I hope that when you're hearing this, I hope that you are, you know, carrying on in this journey and being an ancestor to all of us, to the work that you do, that you have inspired, that you have brought important dialogue on. So much love to you, Alice. And um, what ideas are you working on for this year?
Hmm. So once I finished my first book, I truly entered this dry spell of being really unable to write any poetry. I mean, I'm still, of course, doing my academic work. My research is still thinking about the history of the anti-vaccination movement and all of the stuff related to anti-vaccine rhetoric, particularly the sort of anti-autism stuff. But poetically, I think I mentioned earlier when I was talking about how What's Left is Tender is dealing with my own anxieties about writing about my family. I started to turn to another area that I've always had deep anxieties about writing about, which is about my relationship to faith and spirituality. I was raised in a sort of half Buddhist, half Catholic household, but
Mm,
was indoctrinated in neither. My parents wanted to give me the right to choose, which I now realize is a profound gift. But I think I've struggled most of my life, feeling like I'm spiritual in nature, but don't have any sort of, or I've never felt any resonance with organized religion, especially knowing the ways that organized religion has harmed me and people in my communities. And I've been trying for so much of my life to figure out what it means to sometimes be faithless in a world that seems to have faith for everyone else. So the next project I'm working on is really thinking seriously about what does it mean to have faith? Where does faith lie for me? And what are other forms of spirituality that can be receptive to and embracing of queer and disabled experiences. So yeah, that's the next project, and I've been putting a lot of my energy to figuring out what that is for me. But it's
mm.
really hard, really, really hard.
It's interesting because I also grew up in a half Buddhist, half Catholic household, and I
Hmm.
was not indoctrinated with either. And I kind of lean a little bit more on the Buddhist side, but more on the practices, but I don't belong to an institution, as you mentioned. And it is a very interesting dynamic to be in both households. I've seen the extremities of, being in both worlds. And I think that in some ways it kind of is a gift because I get to kind of see what works for me, but also I'm glad that I have the freedom to, make that decision on my own and not feel like I have to be subservient to a religious institution. And I'm actually very curious because I know that we had talked about seeing if you are willing to share a poem that
Hmm.
you've been working on, and I was wondering if you could, like, share a little bit of context of the poem that you will be reading.
Yeah. So I thought a lot about this actually. I wanted to read something from What's Left is Tender. One, because it's the work I've been sharing most with the world right now. And as I was preparing for our conversation, it occurred to me to pick a poem that I think will resonate with both of our experiences. I know you've had a very fraught relationship with your father, and a lot of the poems in the second section of this book have grappled with my own fraught relationship with my father, who I think is a sort of very classically stoic Chinese man who doesn't really wear his heart in his sleeves, hyperlogical, who never really knew what to do with a very emotional, vulnerable, tender queer son. So the poem I thought I'd read is a poem aptly named "The Father," and it is for my father Peter. It's a three-part poem, and it ends specifically with a voicemail that I in my mind imagined my father uh, left me, but never really had the courage to ever leave me. So it's a imagined voicemail that he left after we had a very difficult conversation when I turned 18, when I was going off to college. My father stopped me and asked, if he could talk to me. I was in that sort of rebellious place. And he apologized for not being more of a father figure to me. And in that moment of cruelty, which I acknowledge now, I refused his apology and I ended the conversation. And I know that hurt him immensely. In some ways, this poem is an attempt to sort of go back to that and imagine a different version of that conversation. And these are all the things that I think neither of us were able to say. So this is the father. One, when he witnesses the boy throw his new toy into the corner, something about the man changes. The box of tissues ends up in his hands, and he throws it with the rest of him, narrowing into redness and a cloture of silence that permits nothing else into the room. How do you remember that which should have no referent? What a man refuses to name as anything more than that window incident when he asked his boy of 7 to decide whether a fall will free or will hurt. The boy never answers, but the question is never about the doing, but merely the never doing and the undoing, that which is left to be done, that which is left to a son. 2. When your horse dies, you learn to walk. So you do. Raise a child, mend your socks, patch up your ego, What capital has reserved for you to do instead of her among the rubber gloves, packed lunches, school plays? Your unfortunate inheritance, like the tears you shed that come from some other well that you believed had long gone dry. But the boy also does not know why he cries, so you tell him the best myths you can, even as you loathe it all as fiction, the very same fictions which splatter your apron with sesame oil and shame. 3. Son, I'm sorry for the distance I made, for what I am trying to make up for now as your dad. I was never good with words because I never needed to be, because words are dangerous and repeatable. Say things enough times and they might come true. Your mom and I did, and you came true. But I was not ready for that truth, and you were not ready for that. Now you may be more ready than I am because you did something with the words I thought were dangerous. We are an unhappy line. We are an unfortunate line. But maybe we are also unbound because of the words you dare to say that not one of us will even whisper.
Mm,
Thanks.
mm. Thank you so much, Travis. That's beautifully done, and really appreciate, you just sharing an insight of your own experiences and your own imagination of what could be or what you would like to or of what healing can look like, through our own visions and what it can look like. So I really appreciate that. Um, and as we start to wrap up soon, like what makes you proud of the identities that you carry now?
Yeah. As I was finishing reading, I am reminded a lot of, I think as you described of that work, it you can imagine other ways of being and other ways that scenarios could resolve. And I think across all three of the identities that really define me, I think there's always a sense of dreaming bigger and better. I think of queerness, I think about disability justice. I think about Asian American activism as all fundamental practices of hope, believing that a better world is possible and one that can actually be made, right? So much of the writers that I have come to love who have shaped my work have believed that our respective identities are gateways to other possible futures, right? It's telling, right, that so many queer, disabled folks of color have turned to things like science fiction and speculative fiction because we can imagine better worlds that have more space for us in them, where we can thrive, where we exist. And I think that's the one thing I've become most proud of is that we are trained as dreamers, and we are bold as dreamers. And I think that's something we need now more than ever when despair and cynicism is a very easy position to have.
Mm. If you were to go back to your 18-year-old self, what would
Yeah.
you tell that version?
I think, in truth, I think I would tell that 18-year-old self that he needn't have decided between being disabled or being queer. I think when I was 18, in order to be the out gay man in Los Angeles, I felt like I had to embrace all the hyper able-bodied nonsense that being queer meant. I thought I had to look a certain way. I thought I had to be able to be on a dance floor for 4 hours because that's where community was. And I felt all sorts of internalized ableism in the sense that I kept trying to disavow the fact that I was in pain or that my body wasn't going to meet the expectations of others. And I often say that disability was the last identity I came into consciousness with. And I think if I were to do it all over again, I would tell that 18-year-old self, you can't be queer at the expense of your disability and vice
Mm,
versa. They have to be mutually constitutive. And the people that really care about you, the people that you want in your life, in your bed, are people who are going to embrace both.
mm, mm. I really appreciate all of it. And lastly, where can people find your work?
I
Follow you.
am much like other millennials all over social media in different capacities. Travis C LAU is my handle for most things, but if you want a sort of easy place to find all of my work and the stuff that I do, travisclau.com is where it all is.
Thank you so much. I want to say that this has been such a wonderful, thoughtful conversation, and I'm so glad for having you on my show and for, bringing your fullness into the space. So I really appreciate it, and I can't wait to see what comes next for your work and for what you will share next.
Thank you for all of your community building and all the stories you've amplified with this series. I'm so grateful for you, Randy.